Manhattan was like, say, when Henry Hudson sailed into the harbor. He would have come into a big blue harbor, sparkling waters, forested hills.
The initial plan was to distribute 30 families among the remote trading posts of New Netherland colony. Back in 1660, this wasn't Wall Street, this was a street with a wall.
Essentially, New York was a biracial society from the beginning.
We're assuming that he was killed by the Indians, but we don't have the smoking gun.
The Dutch were going to have an amazing influence on the coming 17th century. Henry Hudson, an Englishman working for the Dutch, in this little Dutch ship called the Half Moon. It was only 85 feet long. He's exploring the east coast of North America. He pokes his nose into New York Harbor, what is today New York Harbor. He spies the river that now bears his name and sails north up it, expecting to find Asia. Well, we know that the Hudson River doesn't take you to China. Disappointed, he leaves and goes back home to Europe. Little did he know that as the result of his explorations, the Dutch would found a territory that would stretch from Delaware Bay at the southern end of today's New Jersey to the Connecticut River, and at its center, its most important node of activity, the Hudson River Valley, and the two cities they found to cap it at the northern end, Beaverwick, we call it Albany, and at its southern end, New Amsterdam, on that island across the bay. Hi, I'm Barry Lewis. Welcome to Dutch New York. Who was Henry Hudson? Actually, we don't know much about him. There's a famous portrait with his name on it, but we know that's not him, so we don't even know what he looks like. But we do know he was a native of London, he was a family man, and he was an explorer for hire.
Hudson maintained a very strict discipline aboard ships, as did all the explorers of that period. Every 30 minutes, you would find them taking measurements of everything in the world around them. In fact, what we point out is they operated like natural scientists. They had a hypothesis that they were testing. And that hypothesis was that there is an alternate route to the Indies. And Hudson set out very systematically to test this in his 4 voyages of exploration.
In the early 1600s, an English company hired him to explore a northeast passage to Asia across the top of Russia. Well, that didn't work out. Henry was certain that passage was on the top of North America.
When Hudson set forth on this 3rd voyage of exploration, he really had 2 ways to make a northwest passage. The whole coast of North and South America was known in detail from Tierra del Fuego at the tip of South America all the way to the coast of Labrador, with 2 exceptions. A little area between the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay and Cape Cod that was virtually unknown, and then the area north of Labrador. When Hudson landed, he landed on the coast of Maine. That put him well positioned to either sail to the north or to the south as needed. He chose to sail to the south, and he went offshore and sailed specifically to the latitude of the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, and only then did he sail very carefully up the Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware coastline, and then he came up the New Jersey coast and entered behind Sandy Hook, and there they lay for several days exploring lower New York Harbor. And on September the 11th, he entered what we know as the Hudson today and followed it all the way to the height of navigation, approximately modern-day Albany, by September 19th.
Back in the early 16th century, the area we know as the Netherlands was a commercially active but relatively remote corner of the Spanish Empire. By the middle of that century, the people we call the Dutch converted to Protestantism, rebelled against their Spanish Catholic overlords, and by 1579, they set up the independent Dutch Republic. The Spanish and the Dutch go at each other for 80 years over this issue. One of the few breaks in that conflict was a 12-year truce that began in 1609. That truce was the incentive that sent Henry Hudson to the New World on his historic voyage. As for the Dutch, free of Spanish control, they prospered immediately. By the early 1600s, they're not only making money, they're beginning to achieve greatness in the arts, sciences, philosophy, international law. This little nation of 1.5 million people entered the era we still call today the Dutch Golden Age. Amsterdam will become the city of Europe of the 17th century. In that era, it will be one of Europe's largest cities, one of its richest, certainly its most educated, its most middle class, and its most tolerant. The Dutch tolerated you by leaving you alone. And by not persecuting people just because they had a different opinion, the Dutch were creating the first modern secular society in European history. These unique Dutch values travel across the Atlantic in Dutch cargo ships. True, some of those ships carried slaves, but they also carried to North America a new idea of how a society should work. And that idea was certainly applied to the colony's main settlement at the mouth of the Hudson River. From its very beginnings, that little burg at the southern tip of Manhattan Island had more in common with its mother city than just a name. We were not like Boston or Philadelphia. They were English. We were New Amsterdam, and we were Dutch. Now you're going to have to use your imagination. We're on Manhattan Island just before Hudson arrived. We're at the water's edge. It's Pearl Street today. And in back of us is a curving freshwater stream that emptied into the East River. We can still see the curve of that stream in the layout of today's Broad Street. That stream ran through a landmass here at the southern end of Manhattan, much smaller than the one we know today. All in all, this must have been a truly remarkable place.
If we imagine what Manhattan was like, say, when Henry Hudson sailed into the harbor, he would have come into a big blue harbor, sparkling waters, forested hills, streams draining down out of Manhattan onto beaches and into the Hudson River shore. Probably big schools of fish, bluefish, hunting other fish in the harbor, porpoises, maybe whales. Some of the early maps have whales. And of course, he interacted too with the Native Americans that were living on Manhattan and living on the region. And he traded with them. He wrote about Turkish wheat, which was corn, maize as we know it. So he would have found a very abundant place. And for such a small island, Manhattan was more diverse in terms of ecosystems than Yosemite or Yellowstone or the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. There were black bears on the island and wolves and mountain lions. There were big old growth trees. American chestnut was probably more than half the forest. The understory canopy was probably fairly open because of Native American fires, particularly along their trail system that went up the kind of east side of Manhattan and near the places they were practicing horticulture. We have to look really hard in the modern landscape to see signs of Mannahatta, because they're not obvious to most people. They are there if you look and you know what to look for, but they're few and far between because, of course, the Manhattan landscape is one of the most modified places on the face of the planet. So oftentimes people ask me, when did the ecology of Manhattan change most? And I think a lot of times when people are asking that, they're thinking I'm going to say when the street grid plan was adopted in 1811, or they're going to say when we started building skyscrapers or something. But actually, I think the ecology changed most right after the Dutch settled on Manhattan in 1624, 1625. And there's a couple reasons there. One is they changed the way the Native Americans did their business. So as soon as the Dutch came, that really changed the dynamics of the economy and the social aspects for the Native American, for the Lenape people living on Manhattan. And they were a very important part of the ecology of original Manhattan. So that really fundamentally put the landscape on a different trajectory from what it had been for 10,000 years before that.
News of Hudson's discovery spread quickly, wasn't long before other explorers, backed by other investors, mounted expeditions to the New World to exploit its wealth. And all that activity that started here began at that little island off the southern end of Manhattan. We're on Governor's Island, and the reason is this island was settled by the Dutch before Manhattan across the bay. The Dutch called this Newton Island because when they arrived here, it was covered with beautiful walnut and chestnut trees. They figured it was a small enough island that they could defend. Manhattan would be just too big. One of the first explorers to come here after Hudson was a fascinating fellow by the name of Adrian Block. He was a lawyer sitting in an office in Amsterdam when he decided to become an adventure explorer. He comes to the New World in 3 trips between 1611 and 1614, and on that last trip, he returns to the Netherlands with 2 items that are going to totally change both the European and our history. 1, beaver pelts. 2, this map that shows the Dutch for the first time in writing the name New Netherland. In 1621, the truce between Spain and the Netherlands is over. War has resumed between the 2 countries. In this warlike atmosphere, the Dutch West India Company is formed. It was modeled on the Dutch East India Company, which had been created about 20 years earlier to trade with the East Indies. That means the Indian subcontinent and the islands we call Indonesia. Needless to say, the new company faces west, not east. This new company was not just set up for trade. It had a quasi-military purpose. It was directed to go after the ships of the enemies of the Dutch Republic. That means they would attack Portuguese ships some of the time, Spanish ships all of the time. This Dutch West India Company is kind of a medieval and modern amalgam. It's medieval because it has a monopoly on trade and it has this quasi-military function, but it's modern because it's a corporation that is running it. In other countries, when land was founded, when settlements were made, the land belonged to the king. In the Netherlands, it belonged to a corporation, so the new wealth would be spread more evenly among the middle-class shareholders. This new company immediately set about to fulfill its mandate. It created trading posts on the west coast of Africa, on the coast of what is now Brazil, in the Caribbean, and of course, New Netherlands. Africa provided them with slaves, Brazil with sugar, Caribbean salt, and New Netherlands furs. Even though the Dutch West India Company had been formed in 1621, it took them a couple of years to raise the capital. But when they did, they were finally able to send the settlers over to New Netherlands and create the colonies they needed. The initial plan was to distribute 30 families among the remote trading posts of New Netherland colony. Interestingly, most of these 30 first families were not Dutch.
They recruited and accepted people from all over Western Europe. And the very earliest sort of non-Dutch group were Walloons, who were French Protestants, many of whom had moved to the Netherlands as refugees. Pretty soon on, you begin to get some Africans, and then you get Germans, you get some English, you get people from Norway and Sweden. So it's diverse from the very, very beginning.
A few people were left here in Governor's Island. After all, this was the first base of trading operations. Remember, Manhattan Island had not yet been colonized. The rest of the 30 families were sent to the 3 major rivers that the Dutch laid claim to. That would be the Fresh River, we call it the Connecticut, the South River, we call it the Delaware, and the North River, we call it the Hudson. The pioneers who came here to the Hudson River were sent 150 miles north to the newly built Fort Orange.
18 families are sent up here because the Dutch realized very quickly that Fort Orange is going to be a central trading post, and it needs to be defended and it needs to be serviced.
There, across the river, under the north end of that humongous traffic interchange, are the remains of Fort Orange. It was a major trading post in the lucrative fur trade of the 17th century. It was an early presence of the Europeans in this part of North America. And of course, it's the founding settlement of the modern city of Albany. I'm standing here on the Mohawk River, a few miles northwest of Albany, and back of me, the spectacular Cohoes Falls. Back in the 17th century, the Mohawk River was the main highway through this part of the state for the local American Indians, mostly Mohawks, to bring beaver pelts down through the valley to Fort Orange to trade them with the Dutch for the goods the Indians needed. Those pelts are going to be the basis for the future great fortunes of both New York City and New York State.
The original resource, the exploitable resource in New Netherland was furs. The Dutch are astride the unique geographical configuration of the Mohawk and Hudson rivers, and the amount of furs that can come from the west seems to be unlimited.
The one problem? Those beautiful falls in back of me. It prevented the Indians from taking the river all the way into Albany. About 18 miles west of the city, they had to leave the river around where Schenectady is today and literally take those pelts on their back and trek the last 18 miles into Albany.
Nothing annoyed the Indians more than getting to a trading post and find out that after hauling all of these heavy packs of furs, that there was nothing there for them to trade for. As long as they could keep the trading post well stocked with goods that the Indians wanted, the Indians would continue to bring the furs to them.
Between 1626 and 32, over 50,000 beaver pelts were sent back from here to the Netherlands. By 1657, at the height of the beaver trade, over 38,000 pelts were shipped abroad. Why did the Europeans need all these pelts? For fashion. Back in the Netherlands, the beaver pelts were processed into a beautiful felt-like material and then turned into exquisite broad-brimmed hats. The fur trade around Fort Orange comes to a sudden halt when the Dutch backed the wrong side in a war between the Mohegan and Mohawk Indians. Peter Minuit is now the director of New Netherland Colony. He thinks the situation is too dangerous, and he recalls all these newly settled pioneers back to the more defensible New Amsterdam at the southern tip of Manhattan. It's 1626, and the plans for Fort Amsterdam here in New Amsterdam are well underway. That fort is going to defend us against our European enemies, specifically the Spanish. There's one more item to accomplish to set this colony up on the right foot. Manhattan has to be purchased from the Indians. The key word there is purchase. Other European powers would have conquered Manhattan, probably enslaving the Indians, even killing them. That's not how the Dutch did things. So Peter Minuit purchased Manhattan Island from the Indians for 60 guilders. Now, the Indians didn't have a concept of purchasing land. To them, that agreement was probably more of a lease, a rental, plus a treaty between two peoples. As for that famous $24 price tag, that was set back in the 19th century when the document of the sale was unearthed. Needless to say, with inflation by now, the sum would be much more. But the price of Manhattan Island is beside the point. What is the point is that what became New York began as a business deal and not a bloody conquest. That was the difference between the Dutch and the other Europeans. After the island was bought and the fort was built, the Dutch West India Company set about actually governing their new colony. The political system they set up was very simple. There was a director, a council, and officers. The director and the council had to agree on policy. That's part of the Dutch system of consensus. Of course, the director and the council didn't always agree. That's very Dutch also. But when they did agree, they then had to send back to Amsterdam to get approval of the company's directors.
The problem with the directors is that they're dealing with a time lag between them and their superiors in the Netherlands. They can send a message back or a letter back and ask for confirmation of this law or permission to do this or that, but they may have to wait. It may take months, 6 to 8 months before they receive a reply. So it depended a lot on the willingness of the director to take risks.
During the first 14 years of New Netherlands' existence, there were 6 different directors. In 1638, wealthy Dutch merchant William Kieft arrives in New Amsterdam. Like most of his predecessors, he had no experience for the job. And like most of the previous directors, he probably got the job because he knew the right people.
Willem Kieft had connections with the West India Company, so he became director. Very capable people weren't able to get the job, probably because they lacked these connections.
In 1640, the Dutch West India Company's monopoly over the fur trade is over. The market is open to everyone. Unfortunately, some of these new traders were not honest with the Indians, and they were encroaching on Indian territory. Besides that, Kieft insisted on taxing the Indians for protection. Protection from what? Well, according to Kieft, protection from the English and the other Indian tribes. Well, the local Indians were not happy. The situation was getting messy, and we were heading straight for a disaster.
When population increases, you begin to have tensions between the Christians or the whites and the indigenous peoples. Livestock is getting into the Indian corn. The Indians retaliate by killing livestock. And one thing leads to another, and people start getting killed. And you have an escalation of unfortunate incidents that eventually lead to a full-scale war. And Kieft simply didn't understand how to handle the situation.
Kieft's Indian War lasts almost 2 years and practically destroys the colony. At the end of that period, he's recalled back to Amsterdam to defend his actions. On the way home, a situation occurs all too common in that period. His boat sinks, he's drowned, and all his records are lost. His replacement, a 35-year-old military man by the name of Peter Stuyvesant. Stuyvesant is born in a little town in Friesland in the southern Netherlands around 1611 or 12. His father was a Dutch Reformed minister and had quite a strong Calvinist streak. The younger Stuyvesant almost followed his father into the ministry. Obviously he didn't, but he kept that rigid Calvinist personality all of his life. In 1632, Peter joins the quasi-militaristic anti-Spanish Dutch West India Company. The company sends him to the New World. He rises up through the ranks, becomes a commander, and in a battle with the Spanish in the Caribbean, he loses his right leg to cannon fire. They send him back to Amsterdam to recuperate. Shortly afterwards, he's appointed the new director of New Netherland to replace the hapless William Kieft. Stuyvesant and his wife travel across the Atlantic and arrive in New Amsterdam on May 11, 1647. There at the dock to greet him is the outgoing Governor Kieft, several of the company officials, the townspeople, and off on the side, watching all of this happen, is the lawyer Adrian van der Donck. We're here on the Hudson River by Albany. It's 1641. Landing nearby is a young Dutchman fresh from the Netherlands. His name is Adrian van der Donck. He's 23 years old. He's a recent law graduate of Leiden University back home. That's very prestigious. And he's just been offered a job here in the New World by a fellow named Kilian van Rensselaer. Rensselaer runs a thriving farming community on both sides of the Hudson here near Fort Orange. He wants van der Donck to be this community's new shoot. A shoot is a Dutch term for what we today would call a district attorney. Van der Donck is certainly qualified for the job, but what we're wondering is, why would a man with his credentials leave the Dutch Republic, which at that time had the highest standard of living in Europe, and come here to a raw new country? Well, we don't know why he left, but we certainly know that when he arrived here, he began a 14-year love affair with his adopted country. He doesn't spend a lot of time in Rensselaerswyck. He tries to buy land, that doesn't work out. So ultimately, he moves downriver and transfers his base of operation to the area around New Amsterdam.
The colony that Kieft left to Stuyvesant, Stuyvesant arrived in 1647, was in pretty bad shape. The buildings were in disrepair, the population had diminished, and the morale of the population was pretty low.
The mismanagement of Director Kieft underscored the downside of Dutch West India Company rule. It was arbitrary, authoritarian, and simply incompetent. This situation gave the company's critics here in New Amsterdam a reason to lobby for a better deal. They wanted to be treated like Dutchmen back in the Netherlands. They wanted the same rights of representation, the same rights of tolerance, and the right to have a real municipal government just like cities back in the motherland. This is an extraordinary idea. It was the first time that a colony in the Dutch Empire had insisted on being treated as an extension of the Netherlands. The leader of this fledgling party here in New Amsterdam was the lawyer Adrian van der Donck.
Stuyvesant eventually sees that this guy is a threat, that he has the ability to make trouble.
Stuyvesant accused van der Donck of treason, placed him under house arrest, and threatened him with execution. Van der Donck retaliated by getting his friends in high places to put pressure on Stuyvesant. The director relented. Van der Donck is freed. Almost immediately, New Amsterdammers send van der Donck and two others directly to the Dutch capital at The Hague to plead their case in front of the Dutch government itself. Remember, van der Donck didn't know when he got to the Netherlands, how would the Dutch politicians see him? As a patriot or as a traitor?
He put his neck on the line going back to the Netherlands to plead his case and to convince the directors that there should be more representation for the people.
While van der Donck was away in the Netherlands, Stuyvesant set about to do his job, to set this colony back on its feet. The first thing he did was start negotiations to set the border between New Netherland and New England. That covered him on his northern flank. Then he got rid of a Swedish colony that had popped up on the Delaware River. That covered him on his southern flank.
He's also the force behind building the wall that protects the city from any invasion from the north. We look at Stuyvesant as being very disciplined and very loyal to the company and so forth. But on the other hand, he was a risk taker. He was willing to take risks. He was willing to stick his neck out and do something and risk a reprimand.
While van der Donck is pleading his case for home rule, he's also evangelizing for his adopted homeland. He wanted people to move to the New World. To that end, he writes a remarkable book, A Description of New Netherland. This work is both visionary and encyclopedic, what North America was and what it could become.
If you've read his description of New Netherlands, he's interested in everything and observes everything and makes note of all the flora and fauna and the seasons and climate and so forth.
Van der Donck begins his book with this opening paragraph. New Netherland is a very beautiful, pleasant, healthy, and delightful land where all manner of men can more easily earn a good living and make their way in the world than in the Netherlands or any other part of the globe that I know. Van der Donck's persistence finally pays off when New Amsterdam is granted a municipal charter on February 2nd, 1653. Stuyvesant is kept on as the director of New Netherland, and van der Donck is finally allowed to leave the Netherlands.
Up to that point, the city of New Amsterdam was administered from Stuyvesant's council. And I'm sure he was himself was getting frustrated with a lot of the little picky affairs that he had to deal with. He may have been opposed to it in the beginning because he was losing some authority. But I think in the long run he probably saw the advantage of having them govern themselves to a certain extent.
Stuyvesant and Van der Donck were two strong personalities that intersected at a single moment in history. Stuyvesant was the company man. Because of his disciplined rule, New Amsterdam achieved a permanent place in our history books. Van der Donck, on the other hand, was the visionary. He not only saw the natural resources that this continent offered, he also saw its future role as a democratic republic. That makes Adrian Van der Donck one of our earliest modern Americans. We're here at 55 St. James Place, just southeast of Chatham Square on the eastern edge of Manhattan's Chinatown. This is one of the 3 remaining Sephardic Jewish cemeteries here on Manhattan Island. In 1654, 23 Jews arrive here in New Amsterdam. These were Sephardic Jews, which means their ancestors came from Spain. They were forced out of Spain because of religious persecution. Some of them moved to the Dutch colony in what is now Brazil. When that colony is taken over by the Portuguese, these Jews relocate to New Amsterdam. Stuyvesant doesn't want them. He orders them to leave. But the directors in Amsterdam contradict him. They write to Stuyvesant about this, and I quote, "They," meaning the Jews, "may quietly and peacefully carry on their business as before and exercise in all quietness their religion within their houses."
The Dutch, going back to the 16th century, when they were fighting the war with Spain, decided that there would be no intolerance of other religious groups. And when we talk about intolerance, then we're talking about persecution. We're talking about forcing people to repent upon pain of torture and death. The Dutch said that we will never do this again, this will never be done, and people will be free to believe in whatever they wanted. This is freedom of conscience. So everyone in New Netherland had freedom of conscience.
That meant you could practice Catholicism, you could be a Jew, you could be a Quaker, whatever you wanted in the privacy of your home. But it was only the Dutch Reformed Church who could actually build a public house of worship. Some of the colonists felt this individual freedom of consciousness didn't go far enough. They wanted to, as we would say today, push the envelope. For example, the Lutherans sent for a minister from Europe. He arrives, Stuyvesant is furious, and he sends them back. The Quakers arrive intending to settle in Manhattan. Stuyvesant is furious. He exiles them to Long Island, to the town of Flushing in today's modern borough of Queens. The Quakers immediately try to organize a meeting. Remember, in Quakerism, a meeting is their version of a religious service. One of those organizers was a fellow named James Hodgson. Stuyvesant is furious. He sends out his soldiers to Flushing. They rough up Hodgson. Well, the people in Flushing won't have this. Stuyvesant has overstepped his boundaries. They file a complaint. They lodge a list of grievances with the directors in Amsterdam, and amazingly, the directors rule in their favor. That list of grievances we call today the Flushing Remonstrance. Many of us know it's one of the roots of religious freedom here in America, but few of us realize it's also an excellent example that back then, unlike their European neighbors, under the Dutch system, dissent was part of the political process. Slaves were present in New Amsterdam almost from the beginning. The first arrived in the late 1620s, and they still were arriving in 1664. From its very beginnings, the Dutch West India Company was a major slave trading corporation. They set up forts on the west coast of Africa where they procured the slaves, then they shipped them across the Atlantic to the New World, to colonies like Brazil and even the English colony of Virginia.
Most of the slaves in New Netherland are located in New Amsterdam, but you begin to get some out on western Long Island, what's now Brooklyn, working on farms. But most of the slaves were working in the city in a variety of occupations associated with life of the port.
It's estimated that in 1664, nearly 20% of the New Amsterdam population was African.
Essentially, New York was a biracial society from the beginning in New Amsterdam. And conventionally, narratives of New York's history do not recognize that. They do not tell essentially an integrated story in which blacks and whites are together players in that story.
We're here in Van Cortlandt Park in the northwest Bronx. The city of Yonkers is just to the north. All of this once was part of a 23,000-acre estate owned by Adrian Van der Donck. He was given it as a thank you for helping to settle the Indian wars that broke out under Governor Kieft. We can see from this old map the extent of his land. The southern end of it, around the southern end of today's Van Cortlandt Park, and it extended 12 miles up the Hudson River and east towards the Bronx River. We think his house was located at the blue dot, that would be at the very southern end of today's park, and the red dot, that was his sawmill. It was located on the Sawmill Creek, and it's given its name to a modern parkway. Did you know that the city of Yonkers was named after Van der Donck? Not after his family name, but from his honorific. Back in the Netherlands, a young fellow like him with a lot of land was called a Jonkier, what the British would probably call a squire. So Mr. Van der Donck becomes Jonkier Van der Donck. His land is Jonkers land, and of course it's shortened to Yonkers. In 1653, Van der Donck is allowed to return home from Amsterdam, provided he doesn't take part in political activity. Well, we know from the evidence he did return home, but we also know from the evidence he did take part in political activity. Then, in 1656, he dies.
We're assuming that he was killed by the Indians, but we don't have the smoking gun. We don't have any indication that he was killed except for a verb that is used in the past tense in association with him. We know that he's now no longer among the living. But for such a famous person, or well-known person, I should say, why is there no mention of his death? His book is published in 1655. You would think that someone would have made a note of it somewhere, but there's no record of his death or where he's buried.
We're here on the west shore of the Hudson River in the town of Coxsackie, a beautiful section of the river. And to know where we are in relation to Albany, I'm looking at an old map. Here is Fort Orange, that's Albany today. 20 miles downriver is where we're standing. Where this X is, that's where Peter Bronk builds his house. The name Bronk is probably familiar to most of the people watching this, but that's not because of Peter Bronk. It's because of his brother Jonas. Jonas Bronk was born in Sweden, moves to the Netherlands. In 1638, he's married in Amsterdam. A year later, he and his new wife move across the Atlantic to the colony of New Netherland, where he buys land across the Harlem River from Manhattan Island on what is really the mainland of the new colony. Jonas Bronk's farm was right next to a river that takes on his name. People called it Bronx's River. The land around his farm is called Bronx's Land. Well, anyone familiar with New York knows what I'm getting at. That is the origin of the name, the Bronx. Unfortunately for Mr. Bronk, Jonas Bronk, he's deceased by 1643. We don't know exactly why, but he probably was killed in the Dutch and American Indian Wars that were going on, thanks to Governor Kieft. And his brother, Peter Bronk, who was living with his brother and sister-in-law, Peter moves away from New Amsterdam, moves up the river to Fort Orange, and there, right next to Fort Orange, he buys some real estate. By 1662, he sells all of his real estate in what has now become Beverwyck, moves down the river to where we are now in today's Coxsackie, and a year later, he builds the stone house in back of me today. That 1663 house is the oldest house left in Upper New York State. We're in New Amsterdam, and it's 1660. We're looking at the city on the Castello plan, named after the villa near Florence where it was found. We're standing at the northwest corner of the city, at the land gate in the wall that ran along the northern edge of the city and wrapped around the Hudson River side of town. Now that shows you the Hudson River was a great highway into the interior, but when the boats came in, they docked on the East River. That was the port of entry into New York. It wasn't an uptown, downtown city like we know today. It was an east-west city, and everyone did their business on the East River. That's why all the streets, there's three of them, Broadway, what we call Broad Street, and what we call William Street, they all curved to the east and brought us to the east side of town. Back then, in the Dutch era, the church in back of us, Trinity, didn't even exist. That's a product of the English times. When we're walking around town in 1660, these were just ordinary properties. As a matter of fact, one of these properties, right here, was owned by an ordinary New Amsterdammer named Jacob Wies. Well, here we are, walking along the wall that I mentioned back at Broadway. Back in 1660, this wasn't Wall Street, this was a street with a wall. It was the very first municipal project that the city of New Amsterdam built when it was founded in 1653. And interestingly enough, it was built not to keep out the American Indians, but to keep out the English from Connecticut. We've come down here to the end of Wall Street, at least the end back in 1660, because we've just arrived at Pearl Street. This was the watergate for the wall. Pearl Street was the original East River waterfront. As a matter of fact, that's the reason they call it Pearl Street. New York Harbor was rich in oysters. We've come one block down the waterfront, and we're here at what today is called Hanover Square. I know the buildings are completely different, but the configuration of this square is not much different than it was back in the 1660s. The big difference is, back then, it opened up to the East River. To see what I'm talking about, let's look at one of Len Tantillo's recreations. This shows you this area back around 1660, and you can see it opens directly to the East River. Now we're on Beaver Street. If we followed this street straight through, we'd come to the fort. But to see where we're really going, let's go back to the Castello plan. We were here, Hanover Square. We walked one short block up William, and then hung a left on Beaver, and we're halfway down Beaver between William and Broad Streets. Right across the street from us, well, you're going to need your imagination for this one, but that house was Isaac DeForest Red Lion Brewery. How do we know it was a brewery? The well in back of the house. Beer needs water to be brewed. And by the way, Red Lion was the most popular brand in New Amsterdam, which means DeForest was probably a first microbrewer. We're here at the corner of Pearl and Whitehall Street. Just in back of me was the fort. Right next to me was the house of Dr. Hans Kiersted. Dr. Kiersted was New Amsterdam's first physician. Right across from Kiersted's, on the waterfront, was the city's weekly Saturday market. And a half a block north of it, on the waterfront, was the city's first commercial pier, which means this was the beginning of the port of New York. With all this activity around this intersection, it shows us this was already a real city.
Well, you had a fort, you had a series of houses. You have a windmill. It was a very active place because you have longshoremen loading and unloading ships. A lot of warehouses, because remember, this is where the furs came.
One of the major reasons New Amsterdam begins to thrive in approximately the last decade of its existence is that the Dutch have lost their colony in Brazil to the Portuguese. And so New Netherland becomes more important in the eyes of the company directors in Amsterdam. And then you also get a substantial increase in the number of immigrants from the Netherlands coming to New Netherland. The economic situation seems to be looking up. There are more opportunities for independent traders.
By 1660, this was a valuable possession, and it wasn't just the Dutch that wanted it. In 1664, 4 British gunboats appear in New Amsterdam harbor, effectively blocking the port. Stuyvesant is up the river in Fort Orange. He hurries back down to the city, but New Amsterdam is in turmoil.
It was a time of peace. War hadn't been declared. This was a surprise attack.
The major reason, of course, that the English wanted to come into New Netherland was that they had colonies to the north and colonies to the south. And of course, the English claimed that the whole eastern seaboard belonged to them. And then, of course, the Dutch claimed that too.
The English gunboats were within range of the city, and Stuyvesant wanted to keep on fighting. But the odds were against him.
As soon as the first shot is fired in defense of the city is now open to looting. And many of the New Englanders who had settled in Dutch jurisdiction were already at the ferry, ready to come over. English soldiers had been landed on Long Island, and it would have been a mess.
So in late August 1664, without firing a shot, New Amsterdam becomes New York, renamed for the English king's brother, the Duke of York, who himself will be king one day. Richard Nicolls is appointed governor, and the original 13 colonies are beginning to take shape. It was here that the Articles of Capitulation were signed on September 6, 1664, ending Dutch rule. We're here in Manhattan's East Village on Stuyvesant Street between 2nd and 3rd Avenues. And it was on this site that Stuyvesant's country house, which doubled as a working farm, was located. That act of surrender was signed in his house. Now, that farm of his, here's an old map, and it shows us where it was in relation to the city back in the 1660s. There's New Amsterdam at the southern tip of the island. About 2 miles north is Stuyvesant's farm, bordered by today's 5th Street on the south, about 23rd Street on the north, about 4th Avenue on the west, and the East River on the east. And we are right at that red dot. At the surrender ceremony, neither Stuyvesant nor the English governor, Richard Nicolls, were actually present. Well, that was usual for those times. They sent delegates in their place. What was unusual were the terms of the surrender. This was truly an amazing document. It didn't replace one culture with another, which was typical of conquest in those days. Instead, it created a sphere of coexistence between both Dutch and English societies. The Dutch were allowed to keep their inheritance laws, their laws about business, even their magistrates could continue to sit. And it also kept that quirky Dutch idea of tolerance. That means in its founding documents, and we're talking about the Articles of Surrender, there were certain guarantees for individual rights that did not exist in the other English colonies. These rights will appear more than 120 years later in the American Bill of Rights. After the surrender, Stuyvesant was summoned to Amsterdam to answer for the loss of New Netherland. When that was over, he wanted to come back home. That meant America. Even if they called his old city New York, he comes back here to this farm. He lives out his days. He dies in 1672, around the age of 60, and he's buried in the cemetery of his own estate's parish church. Today we call it St. Mark's in the Bowery. Peter Stuyvesant lies just a stone's throw away from here.
Stuyvesant was the right person at the right time. He was able to hold the colony together longer than anyone else could have.
When the English took over New Amsterdam, they gave the Dutch citizens a choice. They could leave or they could stay. For most of them, the decision was comparatively easy. This was their home.
Probably 90% of the New Netherland population of Dutch origin remains in the English colony. Only a handful of people go back to what they call the fatherland. Most stay. They've established themselves, it's their home. They have property, they have families, they have kinship ties, they have friends, and they're doing pretty well. Because the Dutch remain in New York City in such significant numbers, the Dutch do shape New York culture considerably. Certainly, religiously, they're the major religion until at least the turn of the 18th century. One of the most interesting things about the persistence of the Dutch language is that it takes 100 years. In other words, not until 1764 does the Dutch Reformed Church call, meaning hire, a preacher who can speak in English. I think what really begins to turn it toward the English side is the emergence of the printing press in the 1690s. An English printer named William Bradford. He becomes the first printer in New York. And although he does print a few books in Dutch, the vast majority of books printed by Bradford and successors are in the English language. And eventually a newspaper is started by Bradford in the 1720s in English. And so this, I think, is a really important influence in what they call anglicizing the culture. And the divergence between the New Amsterdam Dutch, now the New York Dutch, and their kinfolk and neighbors overseas becomes wider and wider. In terms of the formal structure of power, the laws, the institutions, of course it becomes an English city. But in terms of social practices, in terms of culture, I think it remains a hybrid city well into the 18th century. And the American Revolution puts everybody on a level playing field because what had been the colony now becomes a state in an independent nation. And therefore people of Dutch ancestry might feel that they might have more opportunity for economic or political success because they're no longer having to follow the directives of governors sent from England.
I'm standing here on the steps of Federal Hall, site of George Washington's first inauguration. This is where our federal government was launched. Ironically, as we've seen, the principles embedded in that new Constitution, the one Washington swore allegiance to, could trace some of their roots to the very streets I'm overlooking. Dr. Gehring captures a part of that unique spirit that was New Amsterdam when he says, and I quote, "Here you have that feeling that you don't have to be born wealthy to be admitted into the upper classes. You can make your way up through your own ability." And I think that that is something that is very New York. I think you could probably say that it goes back to the Dutch sense of equality. Well, that certainly describes our city. We're a place open to everyone, where you're judged by your ability, not your birth, where you hear everyone's opinion, and our motto is, do what you want to do, just leave me alone about it. Am I describing modern New York or 17th century Amsterdam? The streets I'm looking out over were Amsterdam's offspring in the New World. I'm Barry Lewis, and from where I'm standing, I can see Dutch New York.